All right, this is section 9. Today we're going to talk about slavery, which I realize can be a very difficult topic for most people. Like most things in this class, be careful. If you need to take a break, take a break. Okay? So there's kind of multiple levels of slavery, multiple kinds of slavery. Serfdom is one that was prevalent in history, but it's not so much prevalent anymore. This is where you're kind of the property of your feudal lord. This was much more common, say, in medieval Europe than it is anywhere today. Then there's debt bondage. And debt bondage can essentially be, you agree to give your labor to a person or a company or an organization until you've paid off some debt. In kind of the best case scenario, you spend a certain number of years and then you're free of the debt bondage. In the worst case scenario, it's a debt where you can never pay it off. It's, because of interest or fees or, whatever, essentially, the longer you spend trying to pay off your debt with your labor, the worse the debt gets. So you're essentially in this debt bondage for the rest of your life. And then the worst, kind of the the lowest level of slavery is chattel slavery, where essentially you are the property of your master or owner forever, up to and including your descendants. Okay? But what is common to all of them is that A, the slave is controlled by another person. Okay? The master, the owner, some other person. 2, the owner appropriates the labor of that slave. All right, so gets them to do everything from domestic household work to working in a factory to working on a farm, whatever. And then 3, the slave's activities. The slave is kept in control using either violence or the threat of violence. Okay, those 3 things are common to all the different kinds of slavery. And that's what kind of defines what slavery is. So history is full of examples of slavery. It's been in basically all different parts of the world since recorded human history. In ancient Greece, there were slaves that you won in war. So like captured prisoners of war or captured people who were on the other team or some kind. There are house slaves that helped you around the house, did dishes and cooked food and cleaned things. There were chattel slaves in ancient Greece. And then finally there was debt bondage, i.e. I owe you a certain amount of money. Instead of paying you in gold or silver, I'll pay you with a certain amount of labor for a certain period of time. In Rome, this was kind of simplified, and there was you could keep other Roman citizens in debt bondage, but you could have actual chattel slavery for anybody who wasn't a Roman, right? So if you captured a Briton or somebody from outside of the Roman Empire or somebody who wasn't a Roman citizen, you could keep them as a chattel slave, but other Roman citizens you couldn't. You could only keep other Roman citizens in debt bondage, which was more regulated. They had a few more rights, things like that. In the New World, the slavery really started in Brazil. Now the Portuguese got Brazil in this deal with the Pope drawing a line, and everything east of that line is Portuguese and everything west of that line is Spanish. Essentially that meant that the Portuguese got control of what is now the country of Brazil. Originally they started using the natives, the people who live there, as slaves, but essentially they could escape and go home, so they had a lot of problems with using the natives as slaves. So they developed what became a much bigger industry in slavery, using slaves from West Africa. And they created this triangle trade route. So essentially these merchants would leave Europe in this case Portugal, but it ended up being most of Europe, um, merchants would leave Europe with consumer goods, relatively cheap stuff in Europe, but stuff that the West Africans really wanted, cloth, tools, things like that. They would sail from Europe to West Africa, sell the trade goods to the Africans, get African slaves in return, take the slaves to the New World, sell the slaves there, and pick up things that Europe wanted, i.e., lumber, grain, things like that, raw materials, and then bring those back to Europe. And each stage, each step in that process brought huge profits. So one round trip could make people rich. So this became a very big, very important, in an economic sense, trade route, and it became more popular and more areas in the New World started using these African slaves, because it was incredibly profitable for the slavers to do that. Now, me being an American, and the United States having such a strong history with their slavery, there is definitely a kind of an American bias to this lecture, which I understand and acknowledge, but it's what I know, it's what's famous, it's what historians, at least in the United States, tend to study. But slavery in America, so like in Brazil, we started with the Native Americans. That didn't work very well. So we switched to bringing over people as in debt bondage, Europeans, right? So the Irish would come over and we would put them in debt bondage. Prisoners from England would come over in debt bondage. People in debtor's prison in Europe would come over to the New World to pay off their debt to this debtor's prison. But we only really had chattel slavery with the Africans, right? And in the United States, that was taken to a really, really extreme level, okay? There was no way for slaves to ever earn their way out of debt like there were with the debt bondage with the Irish and the other white groups. It was lifetime servitude, not only for you, but also your descendants. Okay? Slaves weren't allowed to have marriages or families. They could kind of unofficially, but then the owner was free to sell off, husband and wife and child to 3 different other people, right? There was no legal requirement to keep these families together. They had unlimited disciplinary power. You can see in this picture right here, that's a picture of a former slave, and the marks that were left after his, he was punished for something. But up to and including death. I mean, owners could kill their slaves, their African slaves, and face no legal repercussions whatsoever. They tried not to, most of them I should say, tried not to kill their slaves or injure their slaves in a permanent way, because the entire point of the slave was to get labor out of them. And if they hurt them hard enough to where they couldn't labor anymore, they were worthless. So they were cruel and inhuman and found ways to do these really horrible punishments that didn't cause permanent damage in a lot of cases. But there are plenty of cases of slave owners just outright killing their slaves when they weren't useful anymore. They would just be killed. And then slaves had no property rights. Anything that was owned by the slave automatically, legally became the property of the owner to do with as they wished. And there were other places and other times where slaves, even chattel slaves, some or all of these didn't apply to them in other places and other times. But America, in the United States, they did. So this is kind of what I already talked about, where they started with the Native Americans, moved to the debt bondage with other white people, and then finally it was the Africans that really kind of exploded the slavery process in the United States. And by the time slavery ended later on, the vast, vast, vast majority of people in slavery were Africans, not other whites or debt bondage or any of that stuff. That was basically unheard of by the time of the Civil War. And since the beginning, there were people called abolitionists, the people who wanted to end slavery, the people who wanted to stop the process of keeping African slaves in the United States. The really famous one was a guy named John Brown, who actually in the I want to say the 1850s, but don't quote me on that, he actually tried to start a rebellion, like a slave revolt. He and a bunch of former slaves captured an armory where they kept rifles and stuff, and were hoping to use that to arm other Africans and get them to rebel against their owners and start this violent abolition movement. Obviously he failed, but not that long later we had the Civil War, right? There were 13 states that seceded from the United States. We fought that 4-year-long war. Lots and lots and lots of people died. But ultimately the North was victorious, the Union was preserved, and slavery was abolished after the war with the 13th Amendment. So a lot of people think slavery was abolished by the Emancipation Proclamation, but it wasn't. That the Emancipation Proclamation, only applied to the 13 slave states that seceded. It didn't apply to the 4 slave states that stayed with the Union. And B, Lincoln didn't exactly have legal authority over those 13 states at the time because the war was still ongoing. So what really actually ended slavery was the 13th Amendment, which was passed just after the Civil War. But the problem was the 13th Amendment says something along the lines, and this isn't the exact wording, but it's something along the lines of slavery is illegal except in cases of punishment for crime committed, right? So after the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment, there were still a bunch of, there was still need for people to work plantations and farms and factories and all these things. And some people chose to hire workers to do these things, but there were 2 other ways in which they could get this to happen. The first was prison labor, right? So for a long time, prison labor was a huge industry, and different states or different counties would arrest people on essentially trumped up charges, especially former slave, especially African Americans, put them in prison, and then those prisons would hire out that prison labor and make the people who ran the prison a bunch of money. And it was still essentially slavery, but now it had the veil of, oh, well, they're prisoners being punished for this crime, so it was more legal, more, they had that cover for it, so it could survive even long after the Civil War. And then, of course, there's debt bondage that came back more. And in fact, one of the more famous examples of debt bondage was the coal mines, especially in West Virginia, but all through the Appalachians. These coal mines would pay the miners in what they called scrip, and there's a picture of it right there. And this scrip was it was ostensibly like money, but it was only good in the company store. So these coal miners would get paid in this scrip, and instead of being able to take that like they would if they got paid in normal money and go to whatever store they wanted, they had to shop at the company store. And of course, the company store, what would normally be $1 at a regular store was $5 at the company store, but you're getting paid in scrip, so you have to buy it from there. And essentially, these miners, the longer they worked, the more in debt they got. And they could never get out of debt because they were only paid in this scrip. They had to, buy food and rent houses and stuff with this scrip, and the companies made sure that they would never get paid enough to actually get out of debt. So they had to continuously borrow from the company, borrow from the company, borrow from the company. And there's no way for them to ever get out of that. So there was a long history of this kind of debt bondage. And prison labor and debt bondage are things that still exist in the United States today. They've outlawed the use of scrip, and prison labor isn't, they've placed some restrictions on it, but it's still a fairly common practice here in the United States to hire out prison labor, where the laborers don't get paid, and have these jobs that continuously require you to become indebted and indebted and indebted, and you can't, or it's very, very, very difficult to get out of that debt. So what was kind of behind this slavery, and then even post-slavery, this continuation of debt bondage and keeping the African Americans at a lower social class and economic class, it started with social Darwinism, right? So late 1800s, Darwin comes out with his theory of evolution. Racists and powerful people pervert this to kind of make it seem like there are different levels of human, right? With, of course, white people at the top and Africans at the bottom. So they developed this racial hierarchy based on this misreading of Darwin. And then there was this in-group, out-group thinking, right? So white people thought, we're obviously the superior race because we have all the money and we wear clothes and we speak English and we do all these things. Those others must be less than human because they don't do the same things we do, right? So it became this, there's us and them, right? And they're obviously less than us because they don't know how to read and write. They don't have class. They don't have all these things that they told themselves that they had. So a lot of people justified their slavery and keeping these Africans as chattel slaves because they were improving these people. They thought, or justified it by saying they were civilizing them, right? They were teaching them how to be human because obviously they're subhuman as these others, and we need to go through and teach them discipline and how to be civilized and all these things. Which of course was nonsense, but that's how they kind of justified it to themselves and made it seem like keeping these slaves and using these slaves for labor was the good thing to do. They thought they were being, they thought the arrangement was beneficial to everybody involved, which again, of course it wasn't. So they started portraying these Africans as kind of lazy, docile, childlike, inexperienced, naive, simple, right? And this became the stereotype for Africans that still to this day survives in a lot of racist circles. And this kind of stereotype became called the Sambo. That was a kind of derogatory term for the lazy, childlike African who doesn't really know what he's doing and will, kind of do what you tell them because that's what they're supposed to do as these subhumans. Now, one of the problems was a lot of the Africans kind of played the part and acted like that around white people just to not, if they didn't play into the role, they had the possibility of facing violence or even worse outcomes. But if they realized that if they kind of acted like these white people expected them to act, they wouldn't get hurt. They wouldn't get abused. They wouldn't get attacked. the way they would if they acted like, like people, like normal people. Um, so this stereotype became more common, more common, more common, and it's, seen. There was an old movie that Disney made called Song of the South, and it's not very popular these days because one of the characters is this Sambo stereotype character. That, we watch this in the 21st century and we're like, wow, that is incredibly racist. But back then, back when it was made, 40s, 50s, somewhere in there, it was more socially acceptable because this stereotype had a wider belief. People really thought that was how the African Americans were supposed to act. Um, and, we see it today and we're like, wow, that's really, really horrible. But it was, that was kind of how a lot of the population saw these descendants of the African slaves back in the early part of the 20th century. Um, and then slavery was also kind of justified using this economic advantage argument, right? So it started because the white landowners in the New World needed somebody to work their land, and there weren't enough people, right? There just weren't enough people around to do the work. So they imported the slaves for the economic gain of having their land utilized and growing cotton or tobacco or, whatever it was that farm or plantation grew. But then it became cultural, and there was the economic support of the cultural, and the cultural support of the economic, and all these reasons and justifications and views and stereotypes all kind of mixed together and became this society level thing. But by the time of the Civil War, the economic argument, the economic advantage of slavery had really basically disappeared. There was enough people to work the farms. Slavery ended up costing really just as much as actually paying somebody to do the work. So the economic argument for slavery had basically disappeared by the time of the Civil War. But just because it started with the economic, it became cultural, and then when the economic disappeared, the cultural remained, right? The cultural reasoning, the stereotypes, the racism, the racial hierarchy beliefs, right? All those things still remained even after the economic left. So that's what kind of kept it around for so long. But again, ultimately we had the Civil War, but even after the Civil War, the cultural views of slavery remained, and Africans were treated very, very differently and very harshly in the United States, even to this day. So that's going to be the end of the first subsection on slavery. I'll be back with the second subsection.